How do I mute myself?
Okay. So mute everybody except if we're talking to you.
Okay.
Mute your microphone. Yeah. Tam, I see you, but I don't hear you yet. Okay. 2 more minutes. Can someone, Javier, how do you pronounce your name?
Let me get it. Javier. Javier, can you hear me?
Yeah, someone has their audio. Wait, maybe it's me. It might be me here. Yeah, there it is. I need to delete that. Okay, so how do you pronounce your name?
Javier. Javi is okay.
Javi, can you post the Google link? Do you see on Facebook the Google link to the forum for us? Not to the Facebook, but to the forum, and say right now, announce it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's a Google
Facebook.
link in the bottom corner, and the Google link I posted on Facebook. But can you let everybody know that on the forum? It's not fair to people on the forum.
You mean in Facebook?
No, from Facebook to the forum. Okay, look at Facebook, and you'll see my post. And then I have a Google link. Can you say announcement right now? Kind of make it big. Right now, 6 o'clock Eastern Time. Watch.
Yeah, I'll try.
Watch Office
I'll
Hours.
try.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll try. Let me get. My computer is a little bit slow today.
Okay, so.
Okay.
So, mute your microphone there, and we'll get started here. Javi. Okay. Hi, Tam.
I wrote. Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So we'll get started here. And Tam has joined us, and there's maybe a couple others that will join us along the way. It maybe take them a little while to get logged in here. But Javi, can you mute your microphone there? Javi?
Yep.
Can you mute your microphone for a sec?
Yes, I'm doing it. Okay.
Okay, everybody mutes the microphone, and so we don't have any back. Hi, Tam.
Hey.
Hey, how are you doing? Okay, so let's get started. We only have it's now 6 o'clock on the East Coast, and we wanted to do a little bit of hangout with each other. And some will, as I said, join us perhaps later, but let's get started here. And Tam, you sent your questions in to me, and they're very good. And maybe we can start with yours.
Okay, let me pull it up. Give me just a second.
I can pull it up too here for you. One of the things you were saying, in speaking of the Deuteronomic Code and commemorating the dead and so forth, you say, I'm having difficulty following the logic from the war exemption in Deuteronomy 24:5 to levirate marriage to obviating war commemoration. So, in general, can you explain that question a little bit? Do you remember what you were thinking there?
Yes. So in Deuteronomy 20, there's some more war exemption.
Okay. We lost you there. Okay. Google Hangs, that's difficult. So does anybody, Tom, except for me? I can't hear. But I will go ahead and answer the question as much as possible here then. So a lot of the issues with relation to the biblical laws relating to the war dead and so forth, I wasn't trying to suggest that these laws originated in a context of commemorating, or let me back up. And I'm not suggesting that the laws that we do find in Deuteronomy 20, for example, are really about procreation versus death on the battlefield. I do point out, though, that the soldiers who are exempted for the purpose of going back and starting a house, starting a home, starting a family, and that's a very important part of building a nation. So the nation and the identity of the nation takes priority. The other aspect of that is that it's what I asked for the forum and for you guys to think about is how these laws would have made sense in a time when the nation can no longer go about fighting its own wars. And I wanted you to see how the emphasis on the preservation of the name, the preservation of those who could easily be blotted out, are a very important part of the core of the national identity. And so, yeah, that's. Are you there, Tom, to kind of help us with that question? No? Let me look at your question a little bit more. I'm missing the bridge from Deuteronomy 24:5 to the removal of war commemoration. Yeah. Let me go to your next question then, because I'm not quite getting it. But in my interview with Tamara Cohen-Eskenazi, you say that that Tamara, Professor Eskenazi, Rabbi Eskenazi, said that the Book of Ruth reimagines the period of Judges. Instead of warriors being glorified, domestic life is glorified. Does it bear any significance that Ruth is a Moabite and not from Judah? I think what you're getting at there is also that the book is very much also about the integration of the other, and Ruth being a paradigmatic other, a Moabite across the Jordan, and is not really a member of Israel. And from Deuteronomy, Moabites and Ammonites are excluded from the congregation of Israel. And here they are. The story really integrates a woman who is a Moabite into the people of Israel, making her the mother of none other than King David. Now, what I would also point out is, yes, it's the integration of the other there, but it's the integration of the other that's not simply in contrast to Ezra and Nehemiah, but as you may know that Ezra and Nehemiah is often thought to be the antithesis of the book or the story of Ruth, right? That Ezra and Nehemiah talks about mixed marriages and has this problem with all these marriages, whereas Ruth, the story of Ruth is the marriage of Boaz, a prominent man from Bethlehem, the place where David was born, and then how does that work? And what I would always point out to my students is that they really are not opposed as much as Ruth tells of the integration of a Moabite who is not simply coming in and bringing her culture and not assimilating, but rather someone who says in a very prominent position, your people shall be as my people, and your God is my God. Wherever you go, I will go, and there I will be buried, and so forth. She's really casting her lot, as I point out in the David book, casting her lot in with the people of Israel. And it's not about the kinds of marriages that Ezra Nehemiah has in view, where Nehemiah comes and says, oh, look at all these guys, it's guys here now in the male sense, who are marrying women, non-Judahite women, and then their children cannot even speak Yehudit or Judean. So there's not a situation of Ruths who are coming and joining Judah and joining the Judahite project, but rather a situation where there's real the possibility that the society or the community will be ripped apart by the failure to have real integration. And so that's, I think, the difference. Does anybody, Tam is no longer with us, but does that make sense to Barbara and to Javi and Anita?
Yeah, definitely.
Yes,
Yeah.
it does.
Any questions on that where I could clarify a bit more with regard to the the tension between Ruth and Ezra and Nehemiah? No? Is it clear enough?
Well,
Javi, what do you think? Yeah, we can hear you now.
Do you think? Sorry. Do you think that's coming from Ruth? Because I learned that from my Christian reading and years and years and years listening to several preachers saying this is a way from Ruth to honor the family she's going into, to say your God is my God, and just like taking over a culture or a way or a family. It's just a way to honor the other people.
Someone in the forum who might watch this later have pointed out that it's all about the religion. You know, Ruth becomes an Israelite by adopting Israel's God, and I don't think that's a fair assessment. Religion plays a role in it. I mean, she does mention God. Your God will be as my God, but she has many other lines. Your people will be as my people, and I will follow you. So religion is an important part of it, but it's not that that Ruth converts. Later, the rabbis will see Ruth as one of the first converts, and they'll draw a lot of teaching about conversion for later Jewish communities from the Book of Ruth. But in itself, the Book of Ruth is much more, I think, in a story of what we'd call a naturalization. Naturalization meaning like citizens becoming, aliens becoming citizens, aliens really becoming full members of the community. Tam, did you get any of that, or we were answering your questions in your absence? It's okay. So anybody else now? Barbara, did you want to, or Anita, say anything to that about Ruth?
Yeah, I have a question about the Book of Ruth that I posted to the forum, and it's just, where did the story come from? Was it something that was probably a folk tale or in the culture and transmitted orally, or did?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's in contrast to some who take the genealogy at the end of the book and other evidences that Ruth, or at least witnesses that Ruth is actually the ancestress to David. I take that as not the primary reason for the story, but rather a secondary supplement that comes in and makes her even more important than what the story already is. But the story itself is really not about the connection to David, and it's probably a paradigmatic tale, such as we have, for example, with Rahab. Rahab being the paradigmatic Canaanite, who, if Israel is supposed to wipe out all of the inhabitants of Canaan, well, the question arises, is it really not possible to have any Canaanites in our midst? And the story of Rahab and Joshua in the Battle of Jericho affirms, yes, it is possible to have Canaanites in your midst. But it's about those who, like Ruth, although there's some differences there, but very much like Ruth in some ways, who are willing to come out on the side of the nation and risk their lives, as Rahab does, for Israel. She hides the spies, and Ruth is not risking her life in wartime. It imagines a time for which the readers really, or the book is written, and that is, it's in the book of it's in the time of the Judges, but there's really no wars here being fought, and it's trying to show that in this society, even when battles are not being fought, it's still possible for others to become members of the nation by doing something similar to Rahab, but even more similar to Ruth, and that is by casting your lot entirely in with the people of Israel. And it's a poignant, powerful story. There are some questions, though, with regard to Rahab, especially, and Ruth, but especially Rahab, where some of my colleagues compare her to Pocahontas. And if you know who Pocahontas is this colonialized other who was honored in American memory for helping, James. What's the guy's name actually?
John Smith.
John Smith, sorry, at Jamestown, and that's a story that maybe colonizers want to idealize in order to say, look, there are good native inhabitants, and they're the ones who collaborate with the imperial aggressors and the colonizers. That's definitely an aspect to this, but I think there's much more to it, and it would be a waste to simply dismiss it as such, because there's, from the perspective of minorities who want to integrate themselves into a society, this also has a positive aspect to it. About, yes, Ruth, a Moabite, can be a full member of Israel, even though it's banned according to law, by actually through performance, through actions, through deeds, through making, putting her lot in. And it's not about ethnicity. It's not about, only this genealogical, purely Israelite group can be Israel. No, it can be much more diverse than that.
Okay. This was written in exile, correct, in Babylon?
I think Ruth itself must be, post-exilic or
right.
Written after. I mean, some would say it's written during the monarchic period, but I think the questions it addresses really has to be seen in the time of a people of Judah without a state and without a king.
Okay. Thanks.
It's possible that it's earlier, but it seems likely, and most scholars agree, that it's post-exilic, so Persian period or something.
I guess I was asking because I was wondering if there was any chance it could have been at all tied in with, were there any Babylonians who married Jews? I mean, I know that the Jews were pretty much separate in Babylon, correct? But I was wondering if this would have been something that would have spoken to some situations that were going on.
To diaspora communities.
Right.
It seems to me much more interested in those who live in the land, and we don't need to imagine that there is the time of Israel living in the land and Judah living in the land, then comes the destruction, and then comes the times of diaspora, and then the return. It's much more complicated than that, as I pointed out in week 3, that there are many still living in the land. Can you mute your microphone there at the cops I hear? They're coming to get you. Thanks. And it's the point is that it's very much oriented to a community that still continues to live in the land, and these communities did continue even while there was a diaspora community in Egypt and in Babylon. And we need not imagine it in simplistic terms as just mass exile and mass return. It's much more complicated than that. But the Book of Ruth is very much interested in a community who lives in the land, and actually even models that in many ways by saying, look at how Naomi goes away, but she comes back, and Ruth does not become a part of Naomi's clan by simply living with Naomi beyond the borders of Israel or of Judah in the Moabite territory, but she says she follows Naomi back to Judah, back to her land, and it's really that a model of wanting not only to be a part of a people, but being part of a people living in the land too, and who make sacrifices to return to the land. I see David has joined us. David, are you there? Can you hear us? I don't hear him yet. So, okay, Anita, do you have any? Why don't we go to Anita first, and we'll come back since I've. Anita, can I answer any questions or any suggestions for us? Go ahead.
Is my microphone muted?
Yes. No, it's good. I can hear you.
Okay. The talk about the Book of Ruth and how she is joining the Jewish people is bringing up some thoughts that I've had in the last couple of weeks about how Israel and Judah did form, at some point, a common identity. because though there are in ancient times some archaeological similarities, such as standing stones, those are also shared in the greater area. And there are some distinct cultic differences. And
Yeah.
I'm just left wondering, when did they start to think of themselves as a single people? Was it after Israel was destroyed and a large number of
That's a really good question.
Israelis
Yeah.
led
It's a
to
really,
Judah?
yeah. Let me answer that. Okay.
Okay.
I think it's clear enough. Okay. So what is the question is, how does and when does Judah start thinking of itself in terms of Israel? And I'm going to deal with that question in a couple lectures in week 6, because that goes to the heart of the question of why does the Bible originate in Judah and Israel? It's the special, very complicated relationship between these two states, these two societies. But I'm going to show, or at least argue, that it's not something that just comes out of nowhere, that Judahites are then appropriating or expropriating an identity that belonged to Israel and saying, no, you guys are not Israel, but we're Israel. It's not supersessionism in the sense of, let's say, the church saying we are the true Israel now, but rather Judah has a long-standing relationship with the population living in the northern territory that becomes the Kingdom of Israel, and they have common kind of culture up in the highlands, as I pointed out in the first week, and there's long-standing kinds of strategies of survival in the highlands, and religion starts to enter into that, and all kinds of different things in terms of language and of cultural symbiosis that happens and is promoted through the influence of the state of Israel on the state of Judah. And so it's long before Israel is destroyed. There are Judahites thinking in terms of being a part of Israel, but we also have to imagine that there were many Judahites who resisted that and did not want to be a part of Israel and wanted to say, no, we're true Judahites, and we don't have anything to do with Israel. And we see a lot of that within the stories of David, where Judah and Israel are arguing with each other all the time about who really has the claim to David, for example, to bring David back from exile. You can see that in the stories of the Absalom stories. Now, the other part of that is that you have, in the post-exilic period, an insistence that is very similar to this kind of competition we have that we see within Samuel, within the Absalom stories, where some are saying, such as Nehemiah himself, saying Judah is true Israel, and everybody else, like in the north, Samaria, Shomron, and so forth, they are our enemies. Those ideas do persist, but the biblical authors integrate Nehemiah's account into a larger story, and the narrative of Ezra and Nehemiah is pretty much focused on Judah, but and it's very much in contrast to the history that we find in Chronicles, which has a pan-Israelite, a very open, large understanding of who Israel really is. But what the biblical authors in Ezra and Nehemiah do is integrate Nehemiah's memoir, his kind of very almost chauvinistic view of who really Israel is, or what really matters, I guess I would say. He doesn't really use the term Israel. He's all about Judah. But Judah's story then becomes a part of a larger story by bringing his story into the narrative. Does that help?
Now, yes. Now, Chronicles is a newer text, or based upon a redacted version of a newer text than the original stories that are in, like, Samuel and... Am I wrong in thinking this?
Chronicles
that it is
draws...
a newer text?
Chronicles, it represents a revision of an older history that we find primarily in Samuel and Kings. And Chronicles is written in the post-exilic period, and it's trying to do something a bit different. But it is making it's the issues that Chronicles faces are, how do we have a society without a David anymore? And so what they do with David is, what I mean without a David anymore, without a Davidic dynasty, without a big palace and everything that David and Solomon had accomplished, how do we live without them? Once now the dynasty has been wiped out, or maybe it's still surviving for them, and they hope that it will be revived in a greater form, but they're living in a different time. And so they spend a lot of time with David and Solomon in their story, in their history, but they show what did David and Solomon actually do? What was their real claim to fame? It was the temple. They built the temple. And that is, for the post-exilic period, the new institution around which they're really going to come together and shape their identity. Does that help?
Yes,
okay.
It does.
David, I see you there. Do you want to ask a question? Daniel, I'm sorry.
Oh, g'day. G'day, everyone. Good morning.
You're coming from Australia, or?
Yes, I am. It is just after 8, so I'm still in my pajamas and a little sleepy, but I really wanted to join the conversation. Going back to a few weeks ago when you were talking about the idolized war hero, the idyllic sort of chieftain sort of character, you were talking about that in contrast to the Maccabean martyrs and like Judas Maccabeus.
Mm-hmm.
I'm primarily focused. I'm a master's student of Christian origins, and so I have to do a lot of reading of Josephus, the early historian of the first century for Judaism. It seems to me that Josephus almost seems to bear some sort of heroic understanding of the Maccabees, and I know Josephus is a bit later, but do you think perhaps the Maccabees might be an exemption to the rule?
Okay, so yes, it's a good question about Josephus. It's not really what we deal with in our course, but just to explain, because I did deal with the Maccabees, it is relevant. The Maccabees are included in Josephus' recounting of history, and Josephus is, remember, telling history not in the way biblical authors are telling history. He's writing to an audience where he's going to try really hard to make the Jewish case and to show how this works. He's not writing kind of pedagogical, like we're dealing with this week, pedagogical history for the purpose of edification and for learning and for wisdom and something providing Israel an ethos that will make them Israel and make them a community that can really endure loss and so forth. But he's writing to, in many ways, another type of audience. And so he wants to emphasize power and great achievements and wisdom and all kinds of different things that the Jewish people achieved. And it's not really an internal kind of thing. So the Maccabees are something that he can take pride in. Although I would have to say, though, Josephus himself, remember, is one who compromises, right? And his compromise is very much similar to Yochanan ben Zakkai's as well as Jeremiah's in learning to live with Rome, learning to live with imperial aggressors, and surviving. So Josephus is a survivor. He's a Jew who knows how to make it. And whatever he says in many cases about the Maccabees, one has to remember, though, his own way of life was in many ways very similar to Jeremiah and Yochanan ben Zakkai. So Yochanan ben Zakkai is the one who compromises with Vespasian in the kind of a myth that we have from the sorry, the camera's going crazy here. Who is that here? I'm going to knock them off. Okay, so let me, okay. Anyway, so yeah, Yochanan ben Zakkai makes a compromise. The story is about him being living in, is that screen going crazy for you guys too, or is it just me?
It's going crazy.
Yeah, it's going
a little bit.
Okay. Eject.
Yeah, a couple of times, yeah.
Okay. Anyway. Okay, sorry about that.
I wrote in the Facebook that when they get into the Hangout, they should mute their mics so they don't interrupt.
No, they shouldn't come into the Hangout at all. They should just watch it on YouTube. Don't come into the
Yep.
Hangout. People should
Oh,
watch
okay.
it on YouTube. Yeah, but no, Daniel, you're okay. Okay, so to return to the point, Yochanan ben Zakkai is making a compromise with the Romans, and he does it in terms of trying to make sure that he has a community, and it's all about education. And this is in many ways a myth, but it's really about education and survival versus the Patrick Henry mentality: give me liberty or give me death.
Do you mind if I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Why then do you think, in terms of Jewish history and Israeli tradition, why do you think then people like the Jeremiahs are sort of remembered very fondly, and that they have this idyllic sort of place, but some of the history surrounding Josephus being a traitor, I know the magnitude of their survival tactics is quite different and the outcomes, but it just seems like a very shaky tradition to be a sympathizer with an empire. It seems to either get you in a very hot water or a place of remembrance for saving the lives of many people.
Yeah. And you're asking why the Israel? What do you say, Israeli or? Go ahead. Are you there, Daniel? Oh man, it's a bit difficult, isn't it?
Oh.
There you are. Oh, go ahead. What? And your question was what now? The Israeli view, you said, or?
Oh, just like the way, in terms of Jewish prophets or leaders who have to walk this really difficult line of being kind of sympathetic to the situation that they're in, like we can't win this, guys, or like in terms of like Jeremiah is remembered quite fondly for warning the people not to go to these wars and all that sort of stuff, to stay out of the affairs of the nations. But then someone like Josephus is not remembered fondly at all. Like, it just seems to be a very,
it's a difficult case because Yochanan ben Zakkai is very much like Jeremiah, and both are remembered by the rabbis in very praiseworthy terms. But to go to the heart of the question about the relationship between statehood and having a monarchy and making sure that everybody is pursuing this path of that one is actually willing to fight and die for the country. I mean, that's something that's very necessary during times where it's possible, where there is actual viable options to maintain the kingdom. When that's no longer possible, that's where the Jeremiah comes in. We can't beat the Babylonians. And it's like with the Romans, we can't win. It's going to cause more and more bloodshed. So then we got to switch tracks. There's plan A and there's plan B. Plan A is the David track. It's at the center of the Bible. It's not, though, the primary text. The primary text is the plan B. Maybe it should be plan A, but the plan B option. And the plan B option is the Torah. The Torah then becomes central, and it's not the David model. The David model is an important one, but it's only viable under certain circumstances, and what's viable under all circumstances is the Torah model. So the Torah, God becomes king, and the Torah becomes his queen, and it's really they who are at the center and have to be there in order to ensure that there is a people that will be around in order to rebuild the state and to return the loss to reestablish, to say, what David had lost. And it's not all about reestablishing what David had lost at all cost. What's at all cost is making sure that there's a people that can come together and that the community doesn't dissolve. And that's done through education and through law and through all kinds of ethics and so forth. And that's found in the Torah in its most pristine form, according to the biblical authors. Does that help?
Yeah, that definitely. Thank you.
Great. Tam, you're back? Can you you wanted to ask a question, and you got knocked off there at the beginning.
I did. I heard some of it on. I heard the Ruth question on YouTube.
Yeah. Yeah. We want.
Go ahead.
So what was your other questions that I might be able to address?
So my other question was involving the Deuteronomy 24:5 and the exemption from war if one is just married.
Yeah. We dealt with that a little bit too, though. We dealt with that. Maybe you didn't hear that. There's a third question I think you had too.
Oh yeah.
The third question was the biblical authors, the turn the biblical authors make.
Yes.
Does the Persian perspective of domestic life have anything to do with this? Oh, so is there Persian influence on this?
Right.
Do you have any information about Persian life that you're referring to?
No, I don't. It was just the question came to me after I watched the interview with Rabbi Ashkenazi and yourself.
Yeah.
And talking about Ruth in the Persian period being written post-exilic, but centered, set in the period of the Judges. And I was curious if just life in the post-exilic period had something to do with the way that Ruth was written.
Oh, yeah. I wouldn't say, though, it's direct Persian influence, though. It's not something that one learned from the Persians. We do know quite a bit about Persian life from the Greeks, at least, of what they tell us. It's not always accurate, of course. But, no, the Book of Ruth is very much as I noted, very much a model for living under imperial rule, whether that's Persian rule or whether it's another imperial form of rule. Why is it a model for living under imperial rule? It's not about the glorification of the military heroes. Remember that there's Boaz is the Ish Gibor Chayil, who is someone who does something in terms of family life, of ethics in society, and it tries to take a period of the Judges and says, well, here's what really was the finest part of the book of Judges. It wasn't the wars that we fought against our enemies, and why that really reflects, I think, the conditions under which these biblical authors are writing, at least for the book of Ruth, that we have to find a new way of living. There has to be a new ethos. I don't think I had it in the lectures, but in the letter I wrote to the class for last week, I talk about the Crow Nation, and Lear, who wrote about the Crow Nation, and how Crow warriors had to reinvent themselves after it was no longer Crow natives being Native Americans. When it was no longer possible to fight on the prairie, what does one do? How does one live as a Crow? And that really faced a similar crisis of identity for the Crow people. And I think that's what Jane Austen is in some ways doing in her own way, and others, but the biblical authors most certainly.
Okay, thank you.
What are some of the questions that we should deal with from the forum that you guys noticed? What are some of the things that are coming up there what would be helpful for the class to treat? Well, one of the things I just answered, I guess, was, this week we dealt with, I guess it was, I should talk about week 4, but it was a question of week 5 related to education, and they say, well, Dr. Wright says, the whole Bible is about education, but what about revelation? And I tried to emphasize education because it's what kind of form does revelation take? That's what it's about. It's not. Of course, this is revelation, understood to be revelation. This is prophetic knowledge. This is priestly knowledge and Torah and so forth. But what I'm trying to get at is, it could be a kind of a form of knowledge that is secluded and confined to the elites, locked up in libraries for the king. But no, this is a kind of collective curriculum for the entire nation. So yes, it's revelation, but it's also education. It's a broad-based kind of body of knowledge for an entire people. So I don't some of the class, I think, listens to the lectures and does not hear, and they don't hear the kind of typical theological emphasis on these on the Bible, and that is it's correct that they don't hear that, because I am trying to show that the Bible is not just purely theology. It's not something you have to embrace God. It's not all about belief in God and love for God and all the type of theological stuff. There's a lot about that. There's no denying that. But there's a lot more to it. And by focusing on the theological sides of things, that the Bible is God's Word, and Dr. Wright fails to say it's God's Word, then one really has taken the Bible, this amazing corpus of literature, out of the hands of people who don't believe in God. And I think that's the... I wish I had some of those students on the forum or in this conversation, so we could have that conversation. Perhaps you all agree with me, but there are quite a few of the students who are dealing with those kinds of questions, and I hope the message comes across that this is trying to show that the Bible has a lot more to offer than just theological truths for those who embrace a theistic or Christian or Jewish way of thinking.
Can I jump in there, Dr.
Yeah.
Hart? If you,
wait 1 second. Yeah, Javi had his hand up for a second. I saw him pop up.
Yeah, I think what you say is right, because I grew up in a Christian church. So today I was going back to the week 3, where you were talking about how the Bible started, and that and you said something about Nehemiah and Haggai, and you made a comparison about building Jerusalem. That Nehemiah saw it one way, and he said everybody's against us, and we cannot build it because we have a lot of enemies. But Haggai says no, it's because you guys, you don't want to move. You don't really want to do this. So growing in the church, you have you listen all your life. It's about God. It's about love. It's about revelation. It's about loving God with all your heart. But it's not about culture. It's not about, as you say, an education. And my reason, the questions that I always had is like, is that really only spirit, or is just I can take my mind inside of this and see it another perspectives, or have another questions, and not being afraid to have seen like an heretic because I have different questions out of the Christian and believing question, but cultural question.
I think I understand. Thanks for that. As I'll point out next week, a great political philosopher at the University of Chicago, Martha Nussbaum, has done a lot to bring the Greek tragedies, to bear on some of our most basic questions facing our society. And the Greek tragedies have the gods in them. And so how do you then read this literature and see it as really wonderful, powerful, deep, and poignant wisdom, and not believe in Zeus anymore? Is it possible? And of course, Martha Nussbaum shows it's possible. And so the reason why we can't do that with the Bible is because, and you can do it with the Greek tragedies and the Greek myths, is because there's not a whole cult that continues around the Greek myths. You know, there's not a religion. There's not a Greek religion in that sense. And thus, one still reads these things and tries to find out, well, what is it really about? And one could do that also with the all kinds of myths, whether from Sumer or Egypt or what have you. I'm going to mute this guy. And so you get the point that it's because of the fact that Jews and Christians see these texts as scripture, and it's an important part of the whole story, definitely. But because that, then others only see them as scripture and say, well, I'm no longer religious, therefore I shouldn't be interested in what this has to say to me. It's all about God, it's all about, as you say, spirit and spirituality and so forth, and that's just not for me. And then one misses basic questions related to rebuilding a temple in a community that is no longer committed to doing something on the behalf of all, and they're all going along their separate ways. And then how Haggai tries to get them around a common project, and Nehemiah tries to get them around a common building project that's good for the community. And then one learns from this various ways of how communities actually do come together for good. But because it's seen as theology, one just says, well, I can't adopt that because it's not. I don't belong to the religion anymore, and so we have to do something about that. I am also religious. I'm not going to disclose all of that. People want to talk about that, but I'm a religious person. On the one hand, on the other hand, I also feel very sorry, I'm muting somebody. I feel very strong about or what should I say? It's something that's very important to me, that the Bible is acknowledged for an important source of wisdom without it being only theological wisdom. Okay? So, you wanted to ask something, Daniel? Daniel, go ahead. Whoops, I got you muted maybe. Hold on. Hold on. Wait 1 second. I got you muted. You're muted, I think. Can't hear you. There you go. Go ahead. Nope, still not.
In my screen,
Oh,
I can see he's ignored. It's like ignored. In my screen, I can see when I point on his.
Yeah, I think it's muted. It's
screen.
just muted. Okay. Yeah. Can you unmute that, Daniel, or not? Okay. Well, we'll go to someone else. Does anybody else have something to bring in? Maybe that's important from the forum, or what you guys are noticing as questions for students, or you think would be helpful for discussion. Anita? Go ahead.
Well,
Hello?
If
Go ahead,
Daniel's
Anita.
on, why don't you go to his question?
Oh, sorry, guys.
Okay, go ahead, Daniel.
I just wanted to add my own voice to that, because that's a very important topic to me personally at the moment. I have a bachelor's degree in theology. I'm currently doing my master's of theological studies, and when I move to the United States next year, I'll be pursuing my master's in religious studies and eventually PhD. Like what Dr. Wright does is what I would like to do, just in a different setting with different questions. And
I know, everybody wants to do what I do.
Well, yes. Well, I'd love to do a MOOC one day on the New Testament, but that might get me into even more.
Okay, so let's talk about something that's useful for everybody and we only have a few more minutes left. What would do you want to make a point about the
Oh, I just wanted to say that the Bible, people love stuff like Game of Thrones and all those sort of dramas. The Bible's full of that, and everyone can read this and understand it and go for it. Like you don't.
Maybe we need to start emphasizing the more mythic aspects of the Bible, and it will start to become even more interesting to the young viewers. Anita, what were you going to say?
Yeah.
Quick start. The way that I learn things, when I get new information, I put it through a filter of what I already know or what I think I know. And your class is no exception. And one thing that has always struck me about Judaism and how it defines a proper man you know, and it's obligations to the family, obligations to the community, obligations to prayer, but you don't find attached to the concept of a proper man the acquisition of power. And this is different from any other Western civilization that I'm familiar with.
Where do you see
and
that in the Bible?
Talk about it
Anita,
being, yeah.
What are you referring to in the Bible here with the acquisition of power? Give me an example.
Well, I'm talking about Judaism as it's practiced today.
Yeah, but let's not talk about Judaism
what
today.
I'm saying is, you're coming from, when you say that, you're coming from a position where they did not have power.
Yeah.
Except as a community. It begins to put that into more perspective, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I don't want to talk about modern day Judaism and how Judaism
works. No, I understand.
But then what would you like me to answer? Is it related to the Bible itself, or I prefer not to talk about modern day Judaism or religion. But let me or do you want to ask another question to help me understand it?
I'm not explaining it properly because I am referring to, you're talking about how these texts came into being during a period where they had lost power and never really regained power.
Yeah. Well, let me point out that that's in many ways quite interesting, because the Bible is being written even in its final stages during the re-establishment of Jewish power. So it's becoming better. It's not getting worse as the Bible is really taking on its final form. So then the question arises, well, why didn't they have the Maccabees at the end of the book? Or why didn't they tell the whole story with, we were defeated, but we came back, and everything is now great? The reason why, and I'll deal with this next week, the reason why is they want the readers to focus on defeat, on the loss. And what are we going to do now in a situation where that loss, that defeat, that destruction can come again? We're not going to just retell another story about the reestablishment of another state. And it's a good thing they didn't, because that state was also lost, and it was lost again. So Maccabees, Hasmoneans, they go down in a certain sense. They remain for a while, but then they're also destroyed. The second temple is destroyed 600 years after the first temple. So it's not trying to retell how it all comes back together again, but rather to dwell on a situation where we do have in our past great kings and power and so forth. We've lost it. What does one do in the absence of that? Because that's the plan B that's going to sustain the people when plan A is no longer possible. And plan A comes and goes throughout time. But plan B is the one where they really want to say, this is what's going to keep the people together for the long run. One of the things that the question that I want, one of the threads that is very popular is the Elephantina thread, and I just wanted to point out very quickly again that I'm not arguing that the Torah is not finished by the time of Elephantina, but rather that the community living there in these documents really doesn't have a sense of the text being the authority that dictates how things are done. They write Jerusalem and they write Samaria, but it's not the kind of community that we have in Ezra and Nehemiah, where the community in Ezra and Nehemiah is governed by a text. Remember the interview with Aubrey Buster? And she's talking about how textual authority starts to assume this kind of role in society that it doesn't have in Athens, and we see that in Ezra and Nehemiah. But it's not the case in Elephantina either. You know, texts are not the governing authority. And even when they are looking to celebrate Passover, how it's supposed to be done, the Torah is never cited. And it's what is cited are commands of governing authorities, the Persian governors and those above them. So the question is, how do the biblical authors get from that situation where it's all about who really is in control to a Jewish community that says the text is the final arbiter of what we do within our community? and we don't have to simply ask for priestly opinions or some other kind of communal leader to tell us how to do it. Okay, that's the point about Elephantina. It's a very important point. Elephantina should be one of our most important points of reference, and it's right that that thread is so is one of the most discussed ones in the forum, because it really shows that even at this very advanced period, after the exile, during the Persian period, around 400, 450, things are not going the way the biblical authors are imagining it or want it to go. So they have a lot of work to do, and it takes a long time before the biblical kind of model starts to be realized, and it probably has, it's perhaps never realized. So we, and the other part of that story, part of that Elephantina problem that I wanted to draw attention to is we have to distinguish between Israelites and the community themselves and the way the biblical authors depict them. The biblical authors are trying to show a possibility, a model, a way that it can be. So if we find in the archaeological record, whether it's Elephantina or whether from the Mesopotamian documents that we discussed in week 3, or whether it's archaeological evidence from the land of Israel itself, if we find that that they really are not living in any way that resembles the way the biblical authors tell them to live, let's say through the Torah, that is shouldn't be a problem. We have to remember this is a very small group of people who are writing these texts, and they want their ideals and their models to be assumed and practiced, and it's not, and it takes a long time for it to be really instituted. So that whole question of, well, Israel was probably not as or when one is offended by the facts that Elephantina or the communities living in Israel and so forth are not as all kosher as they should be, it just reveals that that we're confusing biblical authors with the way things actually are on the ground among the community as a whole. It's a fundamental disparity, and the biblical authors are writing these texts because it's not the way things are, and they want to push that. And yeah, any other things? We only have 2 more minutes, 3 more minutes. Anybody want to say something in conclusion or ask something? Or Barbara, you haven't spoken for a while.
I guess I'm just trying to get a grasp on the transition of how this happened. Like, what would Israelite life, like village life or family life, have been like before they went into exile? Were there kind of the seeds already of the importance of the family? Like, I guess I find myself wondering, like, why this group of people said, you know, let's stick together and gather all of our writings and center things in the home rather than just to disperse the way most people would.
Yeah, it's good, nice final question. I think that in many ways, as Professor Eskenazi said, that the family was always important. Families are important everywhere we go, whether we, maybe not in the modern world as it was in the ancient world, but families are definitely not something to be diminished, their importance in the society of the monarchic period. But they become central when you don't have the rest, right? They become even more important, and that's really due in many ways also to the clans that are being torn apart through deportation and so forth. We have to remember that, I don't talk about it in the course, but defeat was also a huge hit, not just to the society as a whole, not to the palace, but also to ancient clans living on the land, and who, once they're deported, or portions of them are deported, or they flee for their lives in various directions, that really undermines long-standing family traditions and so forth. And so that may have also propelled the desire for a new family, a larger national family, because once you're a clan, I write about in the David book the Calebites must be a very ancient, prestigious clan. But what happens is that those clans are really destroyed by military engagements over centuries, and then the biblical authors are moving to say we actually are part of one larger family, and that that idea that we can be a part of one larger family probably would not have been possible if it were not for the destruction that individual families experienced. Yeah. Okay, so we're now done. It's 3:57 on my end, and must be almost 7 o'clock on your end, I guess. It has to be, I guess. And so we will call it there, quits. Any final word? I hate having to say the last word.
Just thank you, I guess.
Thank you very much.
Till next time.
Okay.
Very
Let's try to do this next time, and we'll get better at it. It's the second time we've tried this, and we will be, I think, better equipped now to do it next time. Let's hope it was recorded and our fellow classmates could have seen it. So have a good one, guys. Sorry. Have a good one, learners. Take care.
See you online.
Bye.
See you guys.